When Greece became the 12th member of the Eurozone, officially adopting the euro as its currency in 2001, it ceded monetary control of its economy with the ending of the drachma and gave the European Central Bank in Germany power to regulate money printing and broad inflation targets. As only one of many countries in the new currency, Greece was largely carried along by the economic performance of its much larger neighbors in Northern Europe, effectively receiving a discounted borrowing rate lower than it would otherwise. Herein lay the seeds of the Eurozone crisis in 2010, however, as the Greek government, upon adopting the euro, often ran annual budget deficits of over 15%, accumulating a substantial sovereign debt load. When the U.S. financial crisis sparked fears of major bank failures worldwide in 2009, the attention quickly turned to Europe, with peripheral countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy's borrowing rates suddenly spiking, and ultimately resulting in a combination of a record ECB bailout of core European banks after fears of sovereign defaults and the imposition of government spending austerity programs. In the case of Greece, at least, where unemployment remains higher than that even seen during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the decision to remain in the Eurozone is controversial, as the flexibility of regaining control of one's economy is balanced with that of the deeply emotional desire to remain part of the greater European project. Such luxuries, however, can only be enjoyed by those that can afford it, and increasingly, Mediterranean countries like Italy may be deciding they no longer can, casting further doubt on the entire Eurozone project.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time, dear.
На полный разгром гнусских захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is Alex Nicholson with the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. Today, we're going to try to explain what happened with Greece, what happened with the southern countries of the Eurozone in that 2012 debt crisis period. And to assist me with this effort today, I am joined by Adam Smith.
Hey, everybody.
Hank Oslo.
Hey.
And Nick Mason.
Hello.
Okay, so we're talking about Greece. So raise your hand if you remember watching the news back in 2011 through 2013 and seeing Greece all the time in the media.
That's great radio, Alex. I'm raising my hand.
All right.
I remember seeing hapless journalists struggle to explain what was going on other than something's very bad, something Greece, European Union, nothing like, it's a big deal.
Yeah, as I was saying in the warm-up for this, I followed it really closely at the time, and it was just pathetic to see all of these Bloomberg and MSNBC and Yahoo Finance type people just endlessly repeat these tropes, the Greek tragedy and the Troika and the myth of the lazy Greek and all these other things. So before we get into the economic story, which I think is quite compelling and probably not repeated so often or so clearly, I want to dispel a few myths about Greece. So there's this idea that the Greeks are a lazy people, and that is mistaken. So it may be the case that Greek government employees are lazy, but I think government employees everywhere are lazy. So that's not necessarily such a unique feature to Greece. And it may be that the Greek society has a large, effectively communist contingent that has been at least influential in the country since the junta was taken out of power. But it is, nobody works harder than Greeks. Like if you look at private sector labor statistics, the Greeks work, I think they're second only to South Koreans in hours worked. They're very hardworking people. And it's also, you will also see numbers in the HBD sphere that report that Greece has a low average IQ, something like 94 or 96. I've seen that. You have to keep in mind is that the Greeks learned, this is part of the story of the lazy Greek as well, the Greeks learned bad habits under the Ottomans. They were very important in the running of the Ottoman government. And they learned bad habits. They learned to steal from the state at every turn, which was an appropriate strategy to take on at that time under a hostile government. But I think that it seems to me that they carried it over, and I've mentioned this to Greeks, and they think that makes sense, at least the ones I asked. And so there's a lot of tax evasion in Greece. So, that's part of the story too. But that creates an environment where if you're an entrepreneur, you're a high ability, high energy person, you don't want to necessarily be running your business in Greece. So the strongest Greek sector, of course, is international. It floats. It's the shipping sector. So a lot of that's based out of the Ukraine, or now I guess it would be based out of Russia in the Crimea, and Odessa in the Ukraine. And a lot of it's based out of Cyprus. So if you're not in shipping, it seems that what you do is you move to the Anglosphere, and there's a huge Greek diaspora in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, and then also in the United States. So if you imagine that the talented people are leaving Greece, you're going to get a situation where the measured IQ in Greece is lower. So I don't mean to belabor that point, but I just wanted to say that.
Well, I've heard Lebanese say the same thing about Lebanon. I mean, Nassim Taleb is probably the most famous one in America at the moment. Right. And he's kind of an exceptional example, I'm sure. But it does make some sense because they had a huge civil war in Lebanon and a lot of people left. And basically the statement that I've heard roughly is that all the good people left after that, which is...
They're just like the Lebanese, they're bred under this jizya tax system, for centuries. They're hyper entrepreneurs. Like the only people who could stay Christian were the people who could pay the Muslims off. So they're not lazy, people. They just maybe don't like to pay their taxes so much.
Well, also I will say that number of hours worked is I don't dispute that number, and I do respect hardworking people. But there is something to be said for the way you work. I mean, it's also a trope that, don't work hard, work smart is true. And the sort of American version of that is very sort of dog eat dog and ruthless. But if you want to compare it to Germany, and this was the sort of stuff that was being talked about during the Euro debt crisis, basically they were saying, and this gets into the whole premise of the monetary union, that if you want to be part of the euro, you had to be more German. And well, how does every other country have to fall into that sort of requirement? And how does Germany get the privilege of being the leader? But they are the largest economy, but they also do have a way of working that seems to be more than the sum of its parts, essentially. And so, they will actually get to work on time, and then they also leave work on time. That's sort of a interesting sort of duality there. And they don't like waste as much time, sort of like scurrying about, like discussing things. They basically just get to work. And it's maybe not as a sort of open-minded or creative place, but they are probably more efficient because of that. And so I think that shows in sort of their manufacturing sector. And part of why the euro doesn't seem to be working is because all of those countries that previously were able to have their own currencies were able to basically devalue their currencies to compete in manufacturing. And when Germany sort of became this hegemonic system, they were able to export all the periphery, and then they lost their big economic base that was previously in industry. So I think that's partly what's happening. But that's my sort of like overview understanding of what's wrong in Europe.
Sure. So the export component is interesting, right? And I'm not saying what you just said is wrong. It's one layer. It's one part of the story. I think the most, as an aside, the Germans have actually pretty low working hours these days. But as an aside, I already said that. So it's just ridiculous to expect people. I mean, the Germans are exceptional. Like they're, in terms of business, in terms of producing high value machined goods, manufactured goods, like there's really, the Japanese, I guess, but there's really no one close to the Germans, even the Japanese. Maybe
depends on what you're measuring. I would say the Germans are more creative than the Japanese.
They're innovative.
But I would say that the Japanese are more obsessive about little little details. I mean, they have higher quality standards for their manufactured goods. So, and that's that's easily measurable. It's like how many defects per product. That's like
the
shown
Germans
to be.
have been. I mean, they've been punching above their weight in terms of making things since the Bronze Age. You look at these Bronze Age artifacts that they find in Germany; those are just of exceptional quality. It's just absurd, I think, to expect people to have the same sort of economic capacity as the Germans. And maybe you wouldn't want to. Like, I'm not saying the Germans are better or worse than the Greeks. Like, I wouldn't want.
Yeah, I agree.
Greeks to be Germans.
The Mediterranean is a wonderful place, and the sort of quality of life that they have arguably is a lot higher than the frozen north, wastelands of Germany, where people are kind of negative about everything and
neurotic to the point where they're going around the corners of their apartment dusting. Even the Anglos, I don't think we were quite that fastidious. But so there's a concept I want to introduce. It's what F.A. Hayek called the flow of spending. It's also, you can imagine it manifested in statistics as retail sales or current dollar GDP, any sort of broad measure of the amount of money spent in an economy. And it turns out that in a modern economy, okay, and I'm not saying that this is where we would want the world to be in the long term, but the modern economy, which has existed, I mean, it's sort of a continuous process where we move away from home production, working on a farm, trading with your neighbors in kind. We move away from that system, really starting with the reestablishment of markets after the Roman Empire fell to, maybe 1950, that system's pretty well in place, maybe a little bit earlier in the United States and in the United Kingdom, certainly earlier, but let's say the late 1800s. But it turns out that if you do not maintain the flow of spending, that you're going to have economic problems. You're going to have massive underutilization of resources. You're going to have unemployment. And if you think about there's just no way around using economic terminology, an aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. If you have, a shift in the aggregate demand curve, you have less. You can push me on this after to elucidate if this doesn't make sense. But if you have a drop in spending, an unexpected drop in spending, and an unexpected drop in spending could be just, there's less spending now than we anticipated 5 years ago or 2 years ago when we were writing all these contracts and issuing all this debt that assumed basically baked in a certain inflation rate. It turns out that the other way around that is for prices to fall. So it's really hard for prices to fall. You just don't see deflation in a modern economy, contemporary economy of the last few decades, the way that you would even have seen in the interwar period during the Great Depression. So I can tell you that the consumer price index in Greece has flatlined. I can tell you that the consumer price index in Italy has flatlined. It hasn't fallen. And it would need to fall, prices would need to fall in order to clear the markets and get both of those countries back on track. So here's an example. Australia is an export economy. They export iron ore and beef and other commodities. And in the Great Recession, the global financial crisis that happened in 2008 and 2009, those markets collapsed. The price of iron ore fell. The price of basically all commodities fell. And Australia's export sector, it got hammered. But there was no recession in Australia. There was a very brief dip in some of the economic statistics, but unemployment did not rise. The level of employment, the number of people who have jobs, did not fall. And this is because the Australian currency fell by something like 40%. I mean, it's hard to even think about like just what that means for a rich, sophisticated economy like Australia to have a currency fall that much. But it turned out that this was not, the reason the economy kept going was not because the cheap currency allowed exports to rise. It was because the cheap currency was a side effect of easy monetary policy. I think it's called the Reserve Bank of Australia, the monetary authority on Australia, the people who control the supply of Australian dollars. They can create unlimited quantities of Australian dollars, and they can mop up Australian dollars with the assets that they own, basically bonds that they can sell to mop up money. And then they can control, more importantly, they can control the expectation of basically that activity into the indefinite future. they were basically just able to create a perception that spending would be propped up in the business community. It doesn't even matter if no individual business actor understood this, or no individual trader of Australian dollars or Australian bonds for Australian companies understood this. It was implicitly conveyed by their actions. And instead of exports fall in Australia, domestic spending rises to offset. So Australians start going out to dinner more. They start going on domestic vacations more. They start building houses more. And, it kept Australia chugging along. So that's an extreme example. There's other examples. Israel, the Zionist entity, they didn't have any recession. The Israeli shekel fell massively during the recession. It's the same story. Exports fall, domestic spending makes up for it because the central bank basically squeezes the balls of the banking system and of the private sector in general and gets them to keep spending money. Poland did not have a recession. And then if you want to take it to a little more extreme case, Sweden did have a recession, but because they have their own currency that they allowed to depreciate massively, they bounced back rapidly. Iceland had a horrible recession, but because they control their currency, they were able to hang the bankers from the highest trees, metaphorically speaking, and massively cheapen their currency. They had a few bad years where they weren't able to import things. They had to go back to eating fish, but their domestic economy made up for the drop in tourism, which is their export, basically. And,
so can I say a couple things?
Please.
So you're outlining a lot of good examples of how financial and economic shocks affect countries differently. And I think what that sort of implies is that not all economies are the same. So you take the example of Australia, where you have, I didn't know it dropped that much by 40%. I guess that's sort of a trade-weighted number based on...
It may have been against the U.S. dollar, which was really strong at that time. That's from memory. I can validate
Sure,
that
but actually that's a good other example, because it really depends on how your economy works. I mean, if you only export as a percentage of your total GDP, let's say 5%, a strong fluctuation in your currency versus other currencies may not really matter as much as a country that exports like half their economy, like Saudi Arabia, needs to export to
Australia
survive.
does export a lot, though.
Yes, but I was just using that as sort of a possible example. I don't know their makeup that well. But I think the smaller the country gets, as a general rule, and Australia is, in terms of population, a small country, the more likely it is you have to trade to get what you need. Or at least the combination of the land you have and how diverse the sort of resources you have, and including the people, I would say defines how much you have to import and export. The United States, as much as we import, we still actually produce a lot of our own food and things like that.
The U.S. is quite a closed economy, actually.
Right. So what I'm getting at is that if you are vulnerable to these external shocks, it probably would make more sense to have your own currency, because you really can't control the sort of huge macroeconomic system as much as if you were a bigger system. You could ride it out a little bit easier, I would argue. And so in the case of Iceland, I mean, they basically just said, fuck off, bankers. We're just going to take over what we need to do to help our people, which is very refreshing. And most of the other periphery countries seem to be beholden to their bankers, unlike Iceland, which I think is an interesting example. I don't know about in Greece in particular, but they were the worst hit, it seems.
Yeah, so there are different stories here. It's worth just taking a second here to make a point. So there's the banking aspect of this. So there are banks. Banks lend to companies, to governments, and to individual consumers, we would say in economic speak, citizens. That's one thing, right? So they could be evil, they could be bad, they could be greedy. They probably are. But there's also the aspect, what I'm really trying to emphasize is that a government that wants to can essentially prevent recessions by prudent management of the currency, the value of the currency. You can control the amount of spending that happens in your economy, not in real terms, okay? But Zimbabwe shows that you can control the value. I mean, what's the spending in Zimbabwe? Back in the hyperinflation, like they were sending it higher, right?
Didn't they have a $1 trillion note at one point?
Yeah. I actually had one at one point. I have to find that. But you can. People will try to say that it's like a bottle of ketchup, and that if you try to increase spending in your economy by, let's say, 5% to make up for the fact that you just had a big recession and you want to get things back on course, that it's like a bottle of ketchup, and you'll squirt it all over the place. The old glass bottles of ketchup that you had to sort of delicately remove the ketchup from. That's not true. These central banks have a very, very good control over the amount of spending, to the point where they can, in a year or 2 years or 5 years time, they can be pretty sure what that level of spending is going to be. I mean, not down to the last dollar, not down to the last $1 billion, but pretty close. And I'm suggesting that we have all these examples that I've just outlined. That's what Greece could have done and should have done and would have done in the 1970s if this huge crisis had hit them. So there's the bankers, and then there's the government. The government, by ostensibly controlling the central bank, which, let's be honest, they actually do control the central bank. Central banks are not independent.
Alex, I want to kind of probe some of this model. And I don't know how many of our listeners are like real economic autism hours, but I am. So I'm going to enlighten myself, I guess.
Please.
I think like one of the aspects of controversy on the kind of correct policy level here is there's like the export sector, which is where a lot of the currency devaluation happens, and sort of are implicitly subsidizing your export sector by, I mean, you could get kind of down to a sort of mechanical level and say that like you're giving your capital intensive export sector really cheap capital from your central bank by effectively inflation taxing the rest of your economy. And
in the short run, until wages rise.
Right. And this has like enough kind of trickle down effects that your economy as kind of a coherent organism rebounds. There's also the notion of like most of these recessions are in some sense kind of they're triggered through some kind of lens of the banking or broader finance sector, where like if you look at just a generic banking crisis, you have some sort of like the banks are exposed to more risk than they thought, so they halt lending, and the central bank sort of comes in as a bank stop, and grants very loose capital so that those banks can keep on lending. Like these are the sort of I guess
this is the argument for saving banks, by the way.
Yeah, I mean these are kind of the standard models, but in the first case, it does require that you have kind of strong and small compared to the world economy, export sector. In the second case, I mean, I've always been sort of attracted, or I guess was when I paid attention to it, the modern monetary theory guys.
Yeah.
They're very, very good, I think, at examining the relationship between the central bank and the banking sector as like a collection of people with incentives and interests, rather than kind of a term in an economic model. So, I mean, one of the things that we saw in the US was when the Federal Reserve effectively recapitalized, in as many air quotes as you can muster, all of the large US banks, essentially what they were doing was lending banks money at a lower interest rates than those same banks could get from lending money to the United States Treasury.
You're talking about the large monetary easing where they bought basically all the treasuries from the banks and their assets.
Quantitative easing 1 and 2, right, where they massively increased the monetary base, and all the Austrians said that there was going to be hyperinflation. But of course, the market said that there wouldn't.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the Austrians are like, obviously the Austrians have failed to predict anything except for like in as much as you count the whole like Texas sharpshooter thing where they're calling for a recession every year and eventually one happens. It's like fucking zero hedge fallacy. But I mean, what the MMT guys would say is that, okay, so a lot of these interventions that you use to prop up your economy, they might even work, but the technical way in which they're implemented through the banking sector effectively ends up being a gigantic subsidy to the specific bankers involved. So, I mean, before the money, so to speak, trickles downhill, everybody is upstream gets their cut of it. So before the banking sector is sort of doing their lending that they theoretically exist to do, they're being quote unquote recapitalized, which means that their shareholders and executives are getting a large personal subsidy from the feds, which has all sorts of like knock-on effects on their political power, on their influence on your central bank itself. I mean, this is more kind of my attempt to wrestle with my unease at the standard kind of model of, well, you just apply money and everything will be just fine. That seems to have a lot of empirical validity behind it, but I think it's also not really in question that if that's your lever, you eventually end up with a really outsized, in terms of economic size and political influence, banking sector.
Right. So the economy is extremely complicated. It's so complicated and it changes, right? Like, so a theory, like Milton Friedman was correct that a certain definition of money was a very good predictor. It just was a good predictor of inflation in the United States until about 1985 or 1990. But then credit cards came out and that ceased to be true. So we have to be careful about making statements that are true. I mean, it always and everywhere. But so the modern monetary, I'm glad you brought this up because people do like those guys. What their prescription at the end of the day would be, look, you should raise interest rates because that will get the economy back. You know, interest rates are in some way, you have the causality wrong. Low interest rates are not stimulative. High interest rates will actually, stimulate lending. I want high interest rates in Greece. I want high interest rates in the United States, but interest rates are a price, right? So they're affected by two things: supply and demand. Just like oil. Let's think about oil. Oil could be high because we nuked Saudi Arabia and their oil supplies dried up. Or oil could be high because China is booming and they're soaking up tons of oil. They're two radically different states of the world. One is a state in which China is very strong. They're probably importing a lot of things from different parts of the world. And things are, it's a better problem to have than the first one.
It's like interest rate as like the cost of capital versus the return on capital.
Well, it just depends.
Well, I mean, in sort of perfect market theory, those would be the same. But
you would ideally want it's incredibly easy for me to like get to like you always want to pay less and get more. So I mean that I'm not sure from my reading.
High interest rates could be because the economy is booming, and we need to have high interest rates to slow things down. The Fed needs to raise, or the Fed or whatever central bank needs to raise interest rates because there's too much money coursing through the economy and inflation is rising. Or they could be they could be high simply because there has been a problem for a long time and there's just high inflation in general, and that's the case. Or they could be low or high. My point is that high or low interest rates are consistent. If you look around the world, I mean, they're consistent with radically different situations. What I would say to the modern monetary theory guys is that yes, we want to raise interest rates, but we want to do first. We want to do what Donald Trump said when he spoke to that obnoxious bald man with the beard, Kramer, in the very beginning of the crisis. Donald Trump knew exactly what to do. The Fed had to get it out ahead of the crisis. It had to take control of expectations, right? So they control the dollars. The Fed, the ECB, any central bank, they control the currency. so they can control expectations of what is going to
Are you
happen.
talking about Donald Trump being interviewed in what he would have done during the financial crisis of 2008?
The very beginning of the financial crisis, yeah. He said that the Fed had to start easing policy in early 2008.
Was he being interviewed during his presidential campaign or back in 2008?
No. This is 2008.
Okay.
This is the very beginning of 2008, right after Bear Stearns had blown up, when people were freaked out, but the economy hadn't collapsed.
Right. Well, the reason I asked that was because you have to sort of factor in his bias, which of course is everybody has a bias, but he has a lot of real estate holdings. And so he doesn't want to see his real estate value go down, which is directly tied to the interest rates and the sort of confidence level in the economy overall. And so that is his sort of conflict of interest. And then if he was a president, he would also want low interest rates because that's typically more conducive to economic growth as well.
Yeah, well, what everyone really wants is they want money coursing through the economy at a rate which keeps inflation just a little bit higher than maybe you want it to be. But incomes are rising, and there's lots of people changing jobs, so they're moving to more efficient. Theoretically, they're moving to more efficient uses of their labor. Labor is dear. Prices are rising at a reasonable rate. So, I mean, interest rates are just a tool to get there. And of course, interest rates, it all just depends on the context, like what's going on, what's the inflation rate, what's the opportunity cost. If interest rates are high, but short rates are high, but long rates are even higher, then, hey, I can borrow short, lend long, and I can make money as long as there's no recession. So, yeah, the point taken. I mean, Trump absolutely has every incentive. He has skin in the game, and he has every incentive for the economy to be running, at its potential, which I think almost everybody would have that incentive, except for, if you want to go full Uncle Ted, which is a reasonable point of view.
Well, the only sort of there's many actually. So, but one of the main counterpoints that was being discussed during this time, I can't talk too much to the European scene. I do remember a few interviews that I saw on British television that had kind of like this libertarian ethos being espoused. But the counterpoint to kind of like the central banking steering the ship philosophy is the market should decide. And this is, you could probably look at Jim Rogers as being kind of one of the more famous traders who gets interviewed, who talks about how basically what Europe needs to do in particular is go bankrupt and then let those bankers who made bad loans get punished, and then the people can then rebuild. That's a sort of clean the decks argument that also, by the way, was being argued by American economists when the Japanese economy went into deep recession or slow growth and relative recession compared to where it was in the 80s after their stock market crash and real estate crash in the early 90s.
You can do both. I would say you can do both. Like you can punish people who make bad decisions, who make bad bets, and you can prevent the rest of society from enduring.
That's what Henry Paulson said when they let Lehman Brothers fail. Yeah. And then again, that's like, okay, he's a Goldman Sachs guy who knows what really is going on there.
Lehman blew up. Lehman blew up after the Fed had a certain meeting in September of 2008, I believe, and they didn't cut rates as much as the market expected. It actually turns out, I'm going to keep saying it actually turns out because that's a tick I have, I'm sorry. But it actually turns out that markets do more or less steer monetary policy. The stock market, the TIPS spreads, so those are Treasury inflation protected securities. Treasury inflation protected securities give you a market forecast of inflation over anywhere from 1 year to 10 years. So people look at those, and if those go crazy, if inflation starts to fall, if the stock market starts to fall, if commodity prices start to fall, if the domestic currency starts to become strong, like really strong, you can basically, the markets are basically telling you, hey, you're doing something wrong. This is the Greenspan put, so to speak. And actually, this is what Greenspan did in 1987 when the stock market fell like more than it had ever fallen in one day. I don't remember how much it fell. I think it fell like 20% in one day. The S&P 500 fell. What Greenspan did was he calmed people down, and he
did the opposite of what his libertarian philosophy would expect him to be doing.
Well, let's save that libertarian point. I'll just finish this. So the dollar fell 12%. all other indicators except for the S&P 500 started to look pretty bullish. Actually, they recovered relatively quickly, like within the same week. It was Black Monday. By Black Friday or White Friday, everything was actually, people were calmed down, and there was no recession. You can't even tell that there was any issue in the economic data from 1987, and then the end of the 80s ended up being pretty decent period of time. On the point about the libertarianism, so somebody has to make decisions about how many US dollars are going to be created in the long term. So it doesn't really matter, in the short run, how many US dollars are created. What matters is the expectations thereof. But it's the fact that they can control how many US dollars are created that allows them to control expectations. So what I would put to the libertarians is, all right, so we're libertarians. Who's going to control the US dollar? Like, we have this paper currency.
Well, you know what Milton Friedman said?
We want to freeze the monetary base.
He said it should be handed over to a computer that looks at the growth in the overall economy. Now, you can get autistic about what that means, but that's basically what he said. It needs to be basically a consistent, predictable, interventable system. That's what
he wanted a Bitcoin type rule where a certain amount of the monetary base is pre-planned and it just grows at a steady rate. That might be okay. That might not be the end of the world, but you know what Milton Friedman also said just before he died, maybe a few years before he died?
The Iraq War was good, or something like that. I mean, he said some stupid things. I mean, he's not a perfect person.
He was in a lot of pain
Yeah.
At the end of his life. He had a back pain issue. So, I mean, he was really old when he died. He was 98. So we can't hold it too much against him, what he said at the end of his life about the Iraq War, maybe. But I guess I just love Milton Friedman so much from my libertarian days that I can't disparage the man. But he also said that he would be fine having interest rates set so that the spread between normal bonds and TIPS, inflation index bonds, was always at 2%. So inflation was always expected to be at 2%, which would be a market-based, rule where the market would be in control. I mean, what I would say is, like, just have the central bank just not be retarded. Have them be like Poland or Israel or Australia. And then you can have libertarianism within a framework of...
Okay, so maybe you could tell us what Israel and Poland and whoever else you like does.
They don't do anything in particular. They just... They did what Alan Greenspan did. They said, what do we think the economy is going to look like in a year and in 2 years? If we do not like that, and if inflation, if basically it looks like there's too little spending in the economy, the flow of spending is going to be too low, inflation's going to come in below target, unemployment's going to come in below target, then what we're going to do is we're going to go out and we're going to ease monetary policy. We can either cut interest rates, we can give, quote, forward guidance. Forward guidance is basically something Greenspan came up with, where he basically just said, hey, we don't really care that much about inflation, actually. We were lying. And maybe you should bid up asset prices and hire more workers. You do that sort of thing. It's basically, I mean, the recession, this global financial crisis, we don't know the real story. Maybe they wanted to create it for some reason, but it seems to me, if nothing else, it was the incompetency of Ben Bernanke and Jean-Claude Trichet that led to it. So we can talk about Greece, unless someone wants to go in a different...
Let's talk about sort of how the European Monetary Union works a little bit, and then kind of give a background on it, maybe, like why it came to be, and then we can talk about why those countries joined it in the first place, and then why some are looking at leaving, maybe.
So this goes back to what did they call it? Like the European steel community, coal and steel community, right after World War II in the 1950s. France and Germany essentially decided, and there's different conspiracy theories in this, like who was influential. But it seems to be that it was a coalition of like Kalergite cultural Marxists and German and French business interests that wanted to create a common currency. So the German and French, they wanted to have it would be easier to trade if there was no exchange rate risk. So you're pricing things in Deutsche Marks and French francs, and if the business cycle is going differently in those countries, then it creates a risk for you where you're going to get fewer or more francs for your Deutsche Marks, for your contracts that are denominated in D-Marks. So they had an incentive to create it. And then I also kind of just suspect that various bad actors wanted to basically create a terrible situation where there would be recession in different parts of this monetary framework. And then that would basically allow for a mixing of the different European races so that Greeks would have, maybe they weren't thinking of it exactly as Greeks, but Italians would have to move to France or whatever. They wanted to create a situation like the United States of Europe. I mean, even Kaiser Wilhelm wanted to do this. There's been a lot of people who sought to do this, basically to create a deracinated European man who is mobile. Like we Americans will move from Florida to Seattle to Kansas City. They wanted that. Europeans.
You think the monetary policymakers were thinking this stuff though? I mean, maybe I'm sure there are people like this.
I think that there was part of the coalition that wanted to have this done. Yes,
but there were business arguments for it, right? And there were also political arguments.
It's a coalition. It's not one thing.
Yeah.
It's a coalition of interests. But look at maybe I'll lose some credibility by donning the tinfoil hat here, but look at what the European Parliament building looks like. I mean, it is quite clearly from that famous Tower of Babel painting, right?
I agree with what you're saying. I don't know how to sort of proportion it, though, versus the other stuff. I would say there were probably a lot of business interests, which you mentioned, but also there were political incentives for this union to happen. And also the Cold War was going on. And so there was kind of like this uncertainty about, can we stand, disunited? Do we trust America? It was very complicated.
The coalition is Bank Lodge Synagogue.
You want to expand on that?
No, I mean, it's what Alex said it well. I mean, there's a coalition of interests, financial interests, and nefarious racial interests, as well as occult interests.
And anyway, it doesn't matter. It happened. This thing called the European Union happened, and then this thing, it was pre-staged. So the euro was adopted in 1990, if memory serves. So there was a period of something like 2 years where the Italian lira, the Deutsche Mark, the Dutch gulden, whatever they called that, and the French franc were all effectively the same currency. They were merged, so they were made redeemable for each other at fixed rates, which central banks can do because they can create infinite money.
So what time period are you talking about?
This is 1998 to 2000.
Oh, so you're talking about the euro now? Okay, I thought you were still talking about
we'll go back.
the coal
I'm going to go in
community.
reverse.
Okay.
So that's sort of like this transition period, and then we moved to the euro. I believe that happened in 2000, but effectively the euro starts in 1998. Before that, there was something called the ERM, European Rate Mechanism. I think it stood for Exchange Rate Mechanism. So this is the famous mechanism that George Soros...
Snake in a tunnel.
What's that mean?
I mean, that was how it was described as that the exchange rates would be bound within a certain range, and they were going to converge to certain targets, plus or minus whatever. It just has a hilarious name, which is like the sole thing that I actually remember from my international finance class back in the day.
Yeah, so they had a very narrow... There's actually still a European exchange rate mechanism. It's called the ERM2. I believe Denmark is the only one who uses it. And it just basically means the Danish krona has a very, very, very narrow exchange rate versus the euro. So that Denmark's basically on the euro. But this European exchange rate mechanism, it was a lazy currency peg. You had some flexibility, but you basically had to stay within a certain percentage of the Deutsche Mark. And so, as a quick story, there was German Einheit, German unification, and then the German federal government started spending massive amounts of money to house migrants from Eastern Germany and to rebuild Eastern Germany, and it stimulated enormous spending in Western Germany. So they raised interest rates to sort of slow that process down, to sort of crimp the rest of the private sector, while the German government was using the resources of the German economy to rebuild East Germany. And anyway, the high exchange rates caused the Deutsche Mark to rise. a lot. And then that in turn forced the UK to raise interest rates, which started to cause a nascent recession in the UK. And so George Soros probably had inside information. I have no proof of that. I just think it's reasonable to imagine he did. And he had information that the Bank of England was going to leave that exchange rate mechanism so that they wouldn't have to basically do what Greece has done and go into a deep recession, because Germany was sort of doing its own thing and the UK was not doing it. And he made a whole bunch of money on that. But that was the precursor to the euro. So you have ERM, and then you move into the sort of the pre-euro period of 1998 to 2000. And then after, I think it was 2000, we move into, actually, we print this currency called the euro. And, I hope you turned in your Deutsche Marks and your Spanish pesetas, because they're not worth anything anymore. We're using the euro now. Everything's denominated in euros, and we've already had this 2-year transition
I'm actually
period.
fascinated by the transition policies at the time as to how they sort of got people to redeem their old currencies in exchange for this new one, and how the trust was established to make that happen, and all of this in a sort of relatively short time period. Very complicated. And this is the argument that people make against leaving the euro, that it's going to be equally, if not more complicated, which actually seems to be a little counterintuitive, because if you got it to be done one direction in the first place, why can't you go the other direction? But we'll save that for later, perhaps.
Yeah, it's probably easier to take the toothpaste out of the tube than to put it in. And I think taking the euro part would be like putting toothpaste into a tube. But I think that everyone can agree, if you put your mind to it, you could put toothpaste back into a tube.
You would have two currencies simultaneously. There would be euro, but also you'd have your own currency.
Never understood that analogy.
I don't either. I mean, I don't necessarily know why that's the direction.
Back in there, it's like, bro, there's ways.
Yeah, you can do it. I mean, if there's a will, there's a way. It's not like this hasn't happened before. I mean, countries break up.
Right.
Yugoslavia did it. I mean, maybe Yugoslavia isn't the greatest example, but if they didn't have the war, maybe it wouldn't have been so bad. The Soviet Union did it. And Belarus, if nothing else, Belarus survived the Soviet period relatively unscathed. The Soviet transition period, they went from the Soviet ruble to, I guess, the Belarusian ruble. The Baltic states went from the Soviet ruble to their own domestic currencies. Sweden and Norway famously split their currency. It was a gold-backed currency, I think, so it was easier because it was a pegged currency. It was pegged to a commodity market. But they split from Norway in 1910 or something like that. Don't quote me on that, but it's happened many times where currencies split, and there's a period of chaos or mild chaos, but there could be ways to do it. You could do something like Hong Kong does, where you have every Italian lira or every Greek drachma redeemable 1-to-1 with the euro. By backing it with euro and having the cooperation of the German government, you could probably do it. Or, the United States could step in and say, hey, Greece, you're going to use the dollar, right? And they're going to say, yeah, we're going to use the dollar. Or Russia could come in and say, hey, you're going to use the ruble, right? And they could use that as a bridge currency. So you could back the Greek drachma with dollars or rubles or some mixture of them. And then eventually they would sort of take the reins.
So there you go. So you should be in charge of the transition. What I was just going to try to go over a little bit and hear you guys' thoughts on it was, what are the motivations for joining a monetary union in the first place? I was sort of getting to this before, in that the motivations were not just conspiratorial to destroy the European race. I mean, I think there are elements to that, probably, but I doubt they were very explicit, if anything. And so I think the business, political reasons were this. The French wanted to basically ally themselves with the Germans because the Germans have a stronger economy, and they would sort of benefit in having kind of like the maybe lower interest rates from that, sort of the stability and prestige of that. Similarly, the Italians may have wanted that. But I think the Germans are kind of interesting because their motivations were more political. They wanted to essentially have the French be able to be their kind of proxy, because after the Second World War, Germany's name in the international politics and relations scene was very controversial. And so they could never agitate openly for what they wanted politically. But if they could have the French as allies and having the French push for their political agenda on behalf of Germany, they would receive political benefit by unifying. And I think that was the sort of trade that they made. And then the Bundesbank was this other element.
Yeah, exactly. As Macron and Jacques Chirac did in the French president has basically played the liaison for the German foreign policy.
Okay. I didn't know Macron was active back when Chirac was in.
No, I'm just saying today.
Oh, okay, I see.
Today, Trump doesn't. I mean, he meets with Merkel, but Macron is like the face of the European Union in the United States. I would say.
Right.
Maybe you could disagree with that, but.
Right.
You know what I would say? The real. So we have just a perfect coalition here because it's quite a thing to give up your national currency, but the thing is, so there's all this European propaganda. European students in college, in high school, whatever they call their high schools, gymnasiums and those sorts of things. They're massively propagandized in favor of the EU. That's because the business interests and the political interests are aligned. And of course, the political class loves this idea of Brussels, another layer of government for their class of people. You're the MP from Spain, and your kid is going to get to go do an internship at the European Central Bank, or rather the European Parliament, and then he's going to get to maybe even be a member of Parliament. So it's another layer of government. The political class loves it. The business class loves it. I think they shouldn't love it, but they do love it. I think that they're wrong to love it. But the public loves it too, because one, they've been propagandized, and two, it actually, people in Europe, and I typically will not generalize about Europe, but on this point I will. People look up to Germany. People really do. I mean, especially
they do under their breath. They sort of sometimes try to make fun of it because I think they're jealous, but there is an envy there, yes, and it's not always a positive one. But
and it's interesting that Denmark, Sweden, and Norway did not join the euro, and these are the countries. It's like as you go north in Europe. People look down on their neighbor to the south.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Danes and Swedes, especially Norwegians, those assholes, they just look down on everybody in Europe.
Look, who's laughing now? Yeah.
And then,
but this was true during the banking crisis. I remember it. I mean, even before the euro crisis, it was like 2008 when America was having problems. I remember hearing people, in Northern Europe, just like. Well, we don't care. Like, everything's fine. It's like there's nothing wrong here. Yeah.
The Finns who did join the euro. They're a bit of a different. They have a bit of a different dynamic because they hate the Swedes so much, and they kind of like respect Russia. They don't really hate Russia, but they feel a little bit intimidated by Russia, obviously, because Russia has shredded them fairly recently. They love Germany and in Finland, of course, and really in Eastern Europe in general.
I think love is too strong a word. I think they respect it. I don't think they love it. I think there's actually a lot of countries that don't like Germany, but they.
Well, the Finns love Germany. I think that's fair to say. You don't think so?
I would probably agree with maybe the Finns, but I've noticed there's a lot of sort of teasing of the Germans again because there's a lot of envy,
France and Italy,
and irritation, and they. Also aren't wrong on some of their critiques. I mean, Germany's very neurotic, as we've mentioned, and they don't always make the most like down-to-earth sense. They're kind of very obsessive. But yeah, I think it's sort of a respect more than a love. It's kind of like you respect your father, you love your mother kind of thing. And I wouldn't say they're the mother of Europe.
No, certainly not. But the Italians, let's say, the Italian public, it wasn't that hard to convince them that, hey, we're going to let the Germans have a lot of influence over our policy, and we're going to use, not that the public knows what the hell monetary policy is, but we're going to be in the same club as Germany. I mean, if you're going to say, hey, you're going to be in the same club as the most competent or second most competent, top two competent economies in the world. The most solvent entity in the entire.
Yeah, I think that's what motivated a lot of the periphery countries around Germany. They wanted to be part of a more prestigious economic.
It's a prestigious thing.
Club,
and it's a really stupid thing to become sentimental about because this is something that you can't screw up if you want to have a nice country. So I think we could transition into talking about the actual nature of Greece, if you guys are ready to do that.
Well, and I think just getting through the motivations, with Greece as the last one, perhaps. I just think they wanted cheap interest rates. I mean, that's what ended up happening. They just borrowed like crazy.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So
that's a great point. So I've pasted into the chat somewhere the spread between Greek and it's the first graph that I pasted, and we can show this in YouTube. This is the spread between Greek and German and Greek and German bonds. Yes. So this is the premium that Greece has to pay in terms of interest rates to borrow money. So do you guys all see this graph?
Yeah, it's crazy.
So I want you to look at the period before 2008. You can see whatever that spread is, it's less than 1%, right? So the Greeks were borrowing incredibly cheaply. And that's a great point, Adam. Thank you for making that point. That's a great, the Italian and Greek government, they were happy to be able to borrow these are countries that have had inflation in the past, not Italy so much, but Greece has defaulted in the past. It's been ruled by, military dictatorship in the past, which isn't great for business confidence. And, if they can borrow cheaper, then they can buy votes cheaper and they can embezzle cheaper. They can borrow more money, right? So that's what it's all about. So to talk about Greece, what I would actually suggest we talk about first is just to think about West Virginia, believe it or not. This may seem strange, but actually, in some ways, West Virginia is a lot like Greece. So like Greece, West Virginia has a diaspora problem, wherein if you're a high ability West Virginian, you will be sort of like gravitationally pulled out of that state. West Virginia also has a low measured IQ, something like 94, just like Greece's. And Greece is a kind of a one-trick pony. They have coal. West Virginia is a one-trick pony. They have coal. They have coal, and then they have whatever Robert Byrd was able to suck into them in terms of federal contracts and federal, centers and federal employment. And when the fracking revolution took off, when Pennsylvania started producing, more natural gas than certain Arab countries, coal became not competitive because we had all this natural gas in the United States. It was cheap. It was relatively clean. It was relatively low CO2 emissions. It's easy to convert a electric plant that uses coal to natural gas, I'm told. And the price of coal fell precipitously. And unemployment rose in West Virginia. And the level of employment, the number of people who have jobs, the number of jobs in the state fell pretty hard. Now, if West Virginia had been its own country, or if it had at least had its own monetary control, if it had had a West Virginia dollar, it would have fallen in price. The central bank of West Virginia would presumably have, under pressure, the head of the bank would have created more West Virginia dollars and created perceptions that there would be more West Virginia dollars in the future. And he would have stimulated the domestic spending in West Virginia.
And they also would have been able to attract probably transplant factories that they could then employ West Virginians in who are no longer able to work in the coal mines. And I mean, it's a good location, right? It's right on the East Coast. There's lots of customers. So
beautiful. It's a beautiful country to live there. They would have created these West Virginia dollars. The price, they would have had a period of high inflation. The high inflation could be imagined as like putting a special oil into a classic car. There's special oils for engines that are old that run smoother. They're maybe lower performance, but higher, or at least it runs. Is that right, Adam?
I mean, synthetic oil is the best, and you have different grades, but
I've been told there's classic car oils.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, they use different types of oils. That's right.
We'll use that analogy. So they would have run through a period of high inflation, like say Iceland did, and they would have had high inflation, and that would have drawn. Basically the high inflation would have allowed them to lower wages without actually going to people and saying, "Hey, buddy, you're getting a pay cut." You could have lowered wages without offending people's sensibilities, and in the process, you could have boosted, that sort of current dollar wages, the actual amount of West Virginia dollars that you're getting, and that would have allowed people to basically pay off their debts that they'd taken on before this economic crisis happened. But that didn't happen in West Virginia. And at least West Virginia, as a member of the United States, it's part of a well-integrated economy. So there's federal spending, if nothing else. There's welfare transfers from the federal government. The West Virginia government is not able to run a chronic budget deficit, so they don't have this massive pile of debt. If you'll reference one of the graphs here, we're showing a Greek debt to GDP. We can talk about that in a moment. So the situation in West Virginia is not as acute. And West Virginians also have the option. I mean, this is not ideal. I think everyone on this call would sort of favor a more local orientation, not moving around the country all the time to chase work. But if nothing else, given the situation, at least West Virginians can move to Virginia or Ohio or Pennsylvania, and they can get a job in a better economy without moving too far away from it. It's not like Greeks.
Famously, William Binney, the Edward Snowden, before there was an Edward Snowden, NSA former mathematics cipher lead.
He was head of terrestrial intelligence.
Yeah, he created ThinThread, this very efficient way of identifying threats that did not rely on this industrial scale garbage that the NSA does today. He is from West Virginia, very bright guy, but he basically saw that the opportunities were elsewhere. So that's kind of a brain drain issue, slightly different topic.
What's that movie? October Sky?
I don't know.
That's a great movie.
I love that movie. It's about a man from West Virginia who was I don't know how influential he was. He was reasonably influential in the Apollo program. So there's smart people from West Virginia. I know smart people. And even if you're not smart, as long as you're from West Virginia, you're potentially a good person, I would say. Just not being from a coastal bugman zone. But they have this safety valve. But Greeks do not have this safety valve. It's not easy to leave Greece. I mean, Greeks do not speak English. If you're not university educated in Greece, and even if you are, English is a relatively different language from Greek. And it's not like you can move to Bulgaria, or you would even want to, let alone what are their neighbors? Bulgaria, nothing against Bulgarians. Albania, everything against Albanians. But there's just not a lot of options. They can basically go to Germany and be a janitor. And there was cases of this happening where you would be a Greek guy and you would have, a freaking PhD. I remember reading a story in Bloomberg or The Economist from 2013. Some guy in Germany, Greek guy, had moved there to mop floors, and he had some sort of engineering background, because he couldn't speak German. So the European Union is not like the United States. And I'm glad that it's not, but there's no common language. And, if you move to a different country in Europe and you're from, we Americans, we don't care where people are from. I mean, you could be from Russia, you could be from Romania. We might be racist individually, but most Americans are actually not racist, and they just don't give a shit where you're from because they don't know anything about the rest of the world. But in Europe, they know things about their neighbors, and they hate their neighbors. Like every European country. If you're from Denmark and you move to Norway, people are going to be a dick to you. It's going to be an issue, I think. If you're from Germany and you're from Poland and you move to Germany, you're not part of the German society, and you're going to know it. People can look at you. They know you're not German. Even just Poles. They're still blonde. They're still fair-skinned, but there's been so much inbreeding within the borders for so long that, people look a certain way. There's real barriers to movement in the European Union for good reason. So this is the fate of Greece. They have the constraint of West Virginia. They have this recession that hits them. Tourism falls, shipping demand falls, and they're redlined. They've redlined their balance sheet. So from roughly 1980 until 1994, it looks like in the plot. I'm looking at the Greece debt over GDP ratio plot, if you gentlemen would like to reference that. Greece ran up their debt, their national debt, as a share of the total amount of spending in the economy. Good proxy for the capacity to tax the people and service that debt. They ran it up from about 20%, which is a nice low number. That's a number that you'd see in a place like Switzerland. They ran it up to...
Or Russia. I think, isn't Russia pretty low these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's just because no one will... Well, yeah, Russia's actually run fairly well.
They also did default in 98, I believe. But,
98. This is another interesting point. Debt crises only happen empirically. They really only happen when the central bank screws up and allows the flow of spending to fall. But that's an aside. So Greece, they ran up their balance sheet a lot in the 80s through the mid 90s. And then they held it there at about 100% of GDP, which is incredible. This just shows you how low the social capital is in Greece. I mean, I'm a Phil Hellene, but it's just an empirical fact that the current Greek government is trash. It's run by communists. It's run by crooked individuals who don't have a national focus. But they didn't do anything about this terrible debt level that they had through this period, 1995 to 2008. And this is a period where they're doing things like the Olympics, a prestige project, which a tiny country like Greece, with a massive military expenditure, because the Turks could invade at any time. They really could. They could take their islands. They've threatened to take their islands. They've threatened to invade that sort of northern part of Greece, that I guess it's southern Thrace, I guess it is. They've threatened that. So they have to maintain a big military, and they're doing prestige projects, and they're limiting their capacity to do the one thing that you could do to stimulate the economy when you don't have control of monetary policy, and that is government spending. So that you'd basically do classical Keynesianism, which you never need to do if you have your own currency. As Keynes himself actually said, Keynes said many things in his life. He said that that's what Finland did and Ireland did, because they had some capacity to borrow. They threw that away. They threw that away. And so they set themselves up so that if there was ever a recession, they would be completely powerless to do anything about it. And so the Great Recession hits. That's what we call it in the United States. The global financial crisis hits. We call that event in the rest of the world. And the Jean-Claude Trichet screws up. He fails in his mandate, and he does not cut interest rates fast enough, and Europe goes into recession. Okay, fair enough. Mistakes happen. But then what Jean-Claude Trichet does is he starts raising interest rates in 2011. He does this because companies like Airbus and Siemens and these other German and Airbus is Franco-German, and Siemens is basically the GE of Germany.
Yeah, Airbus is an interesting case study because it actually is kind of like an attempt, on an industrial level to do what the EU did, and they've apportioned a lot of the manufacturing, as you mentioned, in Germany and France, but also in the UK and Italy and Spain. Even they've just tried to make it like this like glue that holds together the economies of Europe.
Mm-hmm. So they're getting a lot of orders. French tourism is recovering, in 2010, and the German economy, they did a lot of reforms under what was his name? Gerhard Schroeder, I think his name was.
He was before Merkel, I think. Was he right before her? Or
right before her, I believe.
Yeah, she's been there forever. God, she needs to get out.
Longer than Hitler.
Yeah. Well, he was there for 12 years, but has it been that long?
11, I think.
Oh, no, we're not there yet.
I mean, the point stands, though. She's been there a long time. But the German economy was really reformed under Schroeder. I hope that's his name. And he's
Gerhard Schroeder. That's right.
He was now, the last time I checked, a executive at a Russian natural gas company.
Yep,
so
he was part of the Nord Stream project. They were trying to build a pipeline
evaluate
from
everything
Russia.
that he did in the context of that.
I'm a shameless shill, I guess, for Russia, but so everyone should bear that in mind. But uncompensated shill, I might add, RT, if you're listening. But what's wrong with the Nord Stream? I mean, I think it's great that Germany is going to be able to get Russian gas without the Poles getting in the way.
It's fine. It's just it looked dirty because he was basically like the president, and here's some money now. It's that's how they do it in that part of the Eastern Europe, at least.
Well, I mean, that's how they do it everywhere, right? I mean, that's
pretty much in America.
That's how we got the F-35.
Oh, let me donate to your campaign. I mean, it's not that different.
I just sort of take it for granted. Maybe this is my neo-feudal aspect, feudal perspective. But I mean, if a politician, wants to get some sort of payoff, but he's getting a freaking pipeline built under the Baltic Sea. Think of all the jobs. Think of all the great. Think of like the work.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, actually, there should be that pipeline, and there should be other pipelines so that they don't, have a choke point. I mean, I think that's the only issue when they had that. They turned the gas off to Ukraine before even Crimea, and then Europe was also getting cut off. That was when Europe started freaking out about their natural gas supply.
I'm not in favor of the Russians having necessarily a monopoly on Europe, but I think Schroeder was a pretty good guy, just within the context of not making things worse. Like, I'm not saying, that his policy on like Turkish immigration was great or anything, but I don't even know what it was, but that may have been before him. But he put a lot of reforms in. This is my point. He put a lot of reforms in that really got the German economy ready to compete, ready to do a lot of global business.
Yeah, it's actually good that you mentioned that, because Germany was called the sick man of Europe in the early 2000s. And I think it is under Schroeder's reign that they did implement those, was it like Kurzarbeit rules? It was
short time work?
Yeah. They reformed their labor laws, which allegedly had some huge impact on their economy, which I think is probably a little bit overblown. I think a lot of people like overlook the HBD stuff in the conventional mainstream press. And they just want to look at some stupid policy change that they made. But I mean, you could probably say that helped a little bit. I don't see it as a negative. So, and it was under him, I believe.
Yes. So the story is that they were ready to go. They were, and anyway. So the German economy, it's not overheating in 2011, but it's strong. It's ready for an interest rate increase. It can take one, and the French economy could take one too. And Benelux, to a lesser extent, Austria. Some of the stronger economies were ready. Finland, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland were not ready for an interest rate increase. If they had left interest rates low, it is conceivable that a sort of virtuous cycle could have started to bud in those countries, because Greece didn't immediately have problems in like 2010 even. There was a little bit of concern in 2010, but no one was too worried about it. But then they started raising interest rates, and then what happened is these southern economies immediately started to tank. So the flow of spending actually fell. It had been bottomed out and kind of like holding steady. Flow of spending would be something like retail sales or current dollar GDP or domestic spending. There's no scientific way to say it exactly, but it's just the amount of money that's flowing through the economy in general. That began to fall. Okay, and then when that starts to fall, the bond market puts two and two together. I mean, the bond market's pretty smart, and they realize that, hey, Greece is having a solvency crisis because their tax revenues are not looking too good here. Their economic outlook is horrible. And the spread on Greek debt to German debt is like 1%. I think that should be higher. And so people stop buying. I mean, it works through market processes, and Greek bonds steadily start to rise, or the price of the bonds fall, the interest rate of these bonds it rises that's the trade-off in bonds. And by 2012, this is sort of the peak of the crisis, Greece is 25 percentage points higher than German bonds. And that is, so you can imagine interest rates for something like almost 30% in Greece for 10-year funds. It's unsustainable.
Yeah, and that's a lot. I mean, if you listen to financial economists, they talk about basis points, which is basically 0.01%, right? Mm-hmm. And so that would be 2,500 basis points. So if your increment of measure is like 1 unit to talk about fluctuations in interest rates, and it goes up by 2,500 of those, that's a big difference.
Yeah, careers can be made on a 5 basis point move if you have the right trades in place. So Greece is essentially unable to borrow at that point in 2012. I mean, we remember the crisis, but I'm talking about it in this way because I don't want people to fixate on the troika, and I don't want people to fixate on the minutia of the bailout. The bailout was just a symptom. The bailout was, I think, a game of chicken between the Greek authorities at that point. It was a certain man whose name began with a P, perhaps. It's shameful I can't remember it, but a bald guy with a mustache. He was basically being in a game of chicken with, I mean, who knows how it worked behind the scenes.
Papandreou?
Yes, correct. Thank you. He was in a game of chicken with these people, as to how much sovereignty he was going to cede in trade for a bailout, in trade for money to stave off the creditors and get the interest rate spread down. And it actually took a long time for that spread to come down. As the chart shows, it sort of bottomed out in 2014, and then it flared up a little bit in 2015, and now it's down to under 5%. So Greece is, they're able to borrow, but they're not a sovereign country. They've given a lot of concessions, and their one trump card, their one ploy that they could have threatened was to bring back the drachma, to leave the European Union, well, at least to leave the EMU, the Economic Monetary Union, which probably would have meant getting kicked out of Europe and horribly punished, ostracized, maybe even sanctions, maybe even EU troops would have been sent in. Who knows? But they gave up that card, and I think now they basically don't have any sovereignty. And it was a bad deal. They had nothing to lose, I think, because if you look at what's happened, the promised things have not happened. Like the Greek consumer price index, the Greek GDP deflator, which is a price index that's used to map current dollar GDP into real units. It basically produces an index of like the value of the goods and services that are produced in the economy, an imperfect measure. Those indices have not fallen. Like the price adjustment has not happened. So Greek, total spending in Greece is like back at like the level of 2000 or 2002, but prices are higher. So the only free variable there is real output.
Isn't unemployment or youth unemployment at least like 50%? I mean, it's like past depression levels. It's insane.
It's to the point where I don't even know if the statistics are even viable. Greece has been reduced to third world status. One measure of how bad things are in Greece is the price of a prostitute. And apparently that has fallen precipitously in Greece. So that's like a measure of the desperation, the tail distribution, the tails of the desperation distribution in Greece. And it's just this horrible, horrible tragedy, human tragedy of, it's like the United States had the great, what do they call it? The Great Depression?
Great Recession?
No. 1930.
Yeah, Depression. Yeah.
Depression. So bread lines, it's like that. But that it never, at least the Great Depression ended. 1934 was better than 1933. 1936 was better than 1935, and so on. And you got better. There was a bit of a dip in 37, and then you progress out of it. It hasn't happened to Greece. They just stayed at a low level, and go on to. It's just this situation where if you're a young Greek, like you're screwed. Like you can't get work. You have to leave the country to get work, or you have to. I don't know. Work in the tourism industry. It's some, talk to people about like the Parthenon or something. It's, and not get paid. Like if you're a Greek of talent, and not that people of talent are the only people. Everyone in Greece is just not able to get into the slot in the economy where they could become self-actualized. To use an example of something that I don't necessarily always agree. But I think that it's safe to say that. It's not the worst thing in the world to find something that you're good at, something that you like, and is reasonably remunerative. And they can't do that in Greece. Their birth rate is falling, and I think I'm rambling.
Well, we got a very detailed email, and I forgot to mention this, but this is good that we're talking about Greece now, from a fellow who was actually suggesting this show topic to us, and he kind of gave an example of how I'll summarize the email, but basically he said that if you have a guy in Greece who wants to make Greek yogurt, for example, at the current situation right now, because they're locked into this European system of one currency, they can't even make yogurt cheaper than they make it in Germany. So they're importing Greek yogurt from Germany. And Philip, he's the guy who wrote to us, he said, let's say the hypothetical Greek who's in Greece who wants to set up a yogurt shop. This guy Gregor can't even make his own country's food. It's that absurd because the currencies can't.
How much of this is like not necessarily the currency situation, but the capital accumulation situation? Like, I mean,
Germany is just more productive. Okay, so you can't compete with them. It's like China versus American, ability to create shoes, tennis shoes. I mean,
partially an artifact of having, they had the shit kicked out of them in World War II. But immediately after that, I mean, they've been building steel mills and the sort of social network that lets you sort of have a business network around things like steel production machine tools for forever. Like Greece,
I agree with all of that. But
industrial policy.
What I'm saying is Greece should be able to make food. I mean, it's absurd that they can't. And you could, if you had your own currency, you'd basically just have a really low value currency. And the price of yogurt importation from Germany will be a lot higher in that situation. That's the sort of argument. Yes, of course, there's other factors that influence why Germany is so much more able to create food like that. But I thought it was a good example.
Yeah, I mean, what they could have conceivably done if they wanted to even stay in the euro, I think they just didn't have they didn't have the right mix of inherent leverage capital, the chess pieces to move around. They didn't have the right mix of that and just talent at the top in place. But they could have done something like, look, we'll stay in the euro, but you're going to forgive half of our debt. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say by fiat, all prices in Greece are 20% of what they were yesterday. And you go to prison for 6 months if you raise prices for the next month. Just to get the price level down. They could have done something like that, like a Diocletian type reform, fixing prices. I wouldn't normally be in favor of that, but that might have been something that they could have done. It's very, very hard to lower prices for reasons that aren't necessarily clear, but just empirically. Like the price level hasn't fallen in Italy or Greece, which are the two countries that Spain is starting to recover now, but Italy and Greece and Ireland are not. Italy and Greece are not recovering. And their price
Italy's
levels
a slightly more complex case because of the north and south divide, but overall, yes, I agree.
Yeah, but I think that these price indices are probably dominated by the north of it, just because that's where all the transactions are happening officially, on the books transactions.
Yeah, but you mentioned recovery. I mean, maybe you're referring to prices, but I was thinking in terms of unemployment. Most of it is in the south still.
I'm not sure about that. I think that.
No, it's not. They're not immune in the north, but I still think there's this big disparity. I haven't looked it up, but I could be wrong. But I'd be surprised if the unemployment was lower in the south.
There's a gradient. There's absolutely a gradient. I would imagine. In southern Italy is they're not doing too well there. But I think even in the north, there's huge youth unemployment and underemployment. I know people who've tried to do business in Italy. That's kind of its own story. It's really hard to do business in both of those countries, Greece and Italy.
Sure.
And that's part of the diaspora problem when people leave, especially Greece, because it's like, why would you screw around in this ridiculous half communist, economic environment when you can go to London or you can go to Silicon Valley or anywhere in the US and, do something better, work for a big company or start your own business. Or for that matter, join your cousin's shipping company and work out of the Black Sea or Cyprus. But I mean, that's the story. I think I've laid it out. As long as the ECB is prioritizing economic conditions in France and Germany, which are two economies that seem to be synchronized for the moment, and it will always be Germany who wears pants, I think. They'll be the ones who make the final say. Just because the Germans, it's like unimaginable to them that you would have a period of high inflation to sort of smooth out the rough edges.
Well, what exactly? I know that the European Central Bank is located in Germany. I think that was a big, negotiating point that the Germans fought for. But at this point, what are their actual credible threats that they can make in these sort of negotiations with, let's say, France? What what can they do to get France to comply, basically?
Well, my understanding is that it's based out of Frankfurt. My understanding is that it's a committee that votes, and the voting is in some way proportional. I forget exactly how, but it's proportional to the size of your economy. So France and Germany are the first and second largest economies in the Eurozone. I think the UK is still in the European Union technically, so they're the second largest economy, but they don't have a vote. So they just have so many more votes, and I think there's sort of like a non-linearity where like the more at a certain point, like it doesn't even matter. Like it's not like Spain and Italy could form a coalition. I think that there's just Germany and France have enough votes to just swing decisions, and their attitude, especially the German attitude, is that the Greeks are lazy. You know, they have all these stupid business regulations, and screw them. They're going to have to learn how to act in the new Europe. And this is just a period that they have to go through. You know, my granddad had to build railroads in Kamchatka, so you can go through a period of hard times.
It's also the Germans have kind of not just in the EC or the European Central Bank, but they also have just sort of a dominant position within the institutions of the European Union. Like you really can't have a European Union without Germany, certainly not without France and Germany. Back in the day, there was sort of a tacit agreement that, kind of pre-end of the Cold War, that Germany was going to maintain economic and industrial leadership of the European Union as it was then formed. And in return, France was sort of going to get political leadership for whatever that's worth. And so you end up with a situation where they're doing things like contributing a lot of funding to these shared EU policies. They're a huge market for all of the other European Union countries, not only in terms of industrial goods, but in terms of labor flows. So, I mean, basically, you don't want to piss them off. So if the kind of price of the European Union existing at all, which is massively positive sum for a lot of the countries, is that the Germans dictate monetary policy and maybe your peak output is a little bit less than it should be, given the sort of costs of actually transitioning as well, and the fact that all of your elites are implicitly or explicitly bribed by the rest of the Euros, there's a lot of room for them to throw their weight around. And I think the elite co-option is a huge aspect of it. Like, I mean, the fun exercise is like go and look at the resumes of every minister in like the Romanian government or the Bulgarian government or the Polish or Greek governments, and see like, okay, you know, they went to a lot of these same schools that kind of dictate the worldview. They had a lot of jobs in kind of these EU administrations, and a lot of them, when they leave government, they get jobs at these same institutions. So, you know, they're not necessarily acting in the most concrete, they might say that it's kind of the enlightened interest of their people, but they're acting with this kind of trans-European worldview.
Yeah, I mean, let's name drop Taleb again. They don't have skin in the game. I mean, if you're the child of an MP in Greece or a high-level government bureaucrat, you're going to be working maybe in Greece for the European Union, but your salary is provided by Brussels. And that's the future leadership caste, and that's the people who are in charge in Greece. So they don't, I mean, it's not like maybe they don't care. I don't know. I mean, I've actually never been to Greece. I don't know too many Greeks, but I don't think that they're not like feeling the pain in the same way as someone who's not in leadership, on the leadership track in that country, and someone who might have. They're the people who could hear the argument that I'm saying and maybe be convinced. I don't think that the average person has the even not even necessarily the capacity, but just the level of autism needed to think about this long enough to realize that it's a problem. So I don't think there's a solution. I think that Greece is just going to stay there in a horrible situation. It seems like the economy is sort of starting to come back a little bit. If you look at a few measures of output in Greece, they're taking up a little bit.
Well, why can't they just default?
They could.
So why is the leadership not?
Because they're invested in the European Union. They're not invested in Greece.
Yeah, exactly. They're like our elite. They could
care
less about
imagine how
country.
much pain you could exert on Greece if you had the cooperation of the rest of the EU. Like, given how much of their economy is tourism, I mean, imagine just screw you. Like, we're shutting the borders. No more tourists.
The Guardian and Le Monde and Spiegel will start running stories about how homophobic the Greeks are, because roughly half of Greeks are actually...
I wonder if they would have the guts to even do that, because, I mean, it's like Greece has a pretty credible case to say that they're in pretty dire straits, and it's a matter of survival at this point, and I don't care what you assholes are going to do to me. It's like that's what Russia did, and obviously Greece doesn't have a nuclear submarine fleet, but they... there's a case to be made for like what happens when sanctions are put on, because Alex and my sort of favorite Russian analyst, the Saker, says that basically the people in Russia, after they put the sanctions on, the entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial class actually was very very happy that happened, and they're not necessarily happy, but they're wondering if we'd even want the sanctions to go away, because suddenly all these factories that I built to produce Russian stogies and whatever else they make in Russia now that they don't import from Western Europe are employing people. There's business opportunities now. You might have more of that, just like that example I gave from our friend Philip, who emailed about the guy trying to make yogurt. I would say if they had the right leadership and a more nationalistic type of leadership, they might be able to pull it off, but they don't, obviously.
I mean, it looks like the Greeks obviously have a level of conflict and ancient hatred and persecution with the Turks that we can't fathom. But the Turks, of all people, it seems to be, they're drifting into the Russian sphere. I mean, I think it's even easier for Greece to do that. I'm not predicting that, right? But I think that would be a potential threat that Greece could use as leverage, if nothing else. And if they're ready, if their bluff is called, be ready to do it. If Visegrad becomes its own real power block, leaves the EU, then they could go to the Visegrad group and use them as protection. But I would start threatening to go to Russia, in the most polite way possible. But
I mean, that's still that's only so credible. Russia doesn't have a bunch of money to give as subsidies to its allies. They don't have a bunch of trade relationships that they can kind of divert at a whim that would prop up your economy. They can certainly do defense cooperation, but that's even kind of a double-edged sword in terms of, do the Greeks really want to have that bluff called and be forced into aligning with Russia?
It's a period where you don't come. So somebody in the United States launched a coup in Turkey, right? And so the Turks, after when your quote ally is launching coups against you, Erdogan, you say his name, he's ready to go to Russia, his ancient enemy. But maybe the Greeks aren't quite at that point. But I mean, I would go for it, or I would try to. Yeah, maybe it's not credible. I mean, they would have done it, I guess, if it were conceivable. But Greece is small. I don't know that the Russian public would want to bail out Greece when Russia has so many problems. But there's religious reasons why Russia and Greece are natural allies. They're both Byzantine Orthodox countries. I don't know. I guess the alternative is that they just continue to have a horrible economy kind of indefinitely. And that seems to be the way that it would go. I mean, if you had wanted to make me make a bet, I would say that Greece will have the euro in 10 years. I would say that that's probably going to happen. Italy is the interesting case. You know, the Italians, they might leave, or maybe even the United States, if it were so inclined, you know, could facilitate Greek and Italian, you know, exit from the European
Italy
currency.
specifically is an interesting case because if they wanted to, they're able to almost play the what used to be the North Korea rule of you know, we can blow this sucker up at any time, so please pay us.
Mm-hmm.
Like their stability was kind of an ongoing priority of the EU and the US all throughout the Cold War, partially because of their kind of inherent instability.
Because
but
they had
also
the
because
Red Army faction.
I mean, the Red Army faction was the attempt to destabilize them by the USSR.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, their geographic position, the size of their economy. I mean, if you look at the kind of nominal GDP statistics for whatever those are worth, their economy is about the size of Russia's.
Yeah, it's 60 million people. It's a big
It's
country.
not insignificant. Like Greece because of the specific people that hold their debt and everything else, it would be painful. But Italy deciding to screw around with things, especially in combination with some other parties, would probably cause the entire rotten edifice to collapse, or at least cause some major upheavals if they decided that they were going to suddenly. Because I don't have great confidence either in the Italians sort of gracefully exiting. There were all of these kind of pastiches that were painted back in the day about, like, okay, so let's say you get like the dozen or so people that you need in the government to agree that we want to exit the euro. Like, on a technical level, how the hell do you do that? Because you need banknotes. Like, you literally need a giant printing press that's crapping out drachmas or whatever the Italian
lira.
Italian lira. You need to like plan for a banking holiday. You need to shut down your stock market. You need to like physically seal your borders because people are going to start like liquidating everything that they can liquidate into gold bricks or cocaine or whatever,
Euros,
trying to get it across the border. So, I mean, imagining trying to do that, and then there's just incredible, like, $1-billion incentives for somebody to leak the information, either accidentally or on purpose, to move first. So it just becomes incredibly difficult to do it in kind of the one sharp blow, kind of maximize the pain up front to avoid this drawn-on scenario. Instead, what you end up is like this slow motion, oh shit, panic, where for some reason everybody's withdrawing everything that they can, and there's a banking crisis now coincident with you leaving the thing, you're shutting down the roads, and the food trucks are fucked up. I mean, it could easily be just a disaster, not only economically, but on a humanitarian level.
In the short run.
In the short run, I mean, exactly. It's like, World War II was awful, and this is not World War II, but after the war, it was also pretty bad. But then look what happened to not only Germany, but also Italy and most of Europe, frankly. They had a huge boom. I mean, it was like for 20 years straight. They were building, they're rebuilding, and this is not a war, but it's obviously a lower point than where they were. And so I don't necessarily see the pain as lasting. I think it's something that may be necessary.
It's just not that big of a deal. I mean, it's going to be, and I'm not predicting that Italy will leave. There's no particular reason to think that Italy would leave the euro. But, worse things have happened. I mean, there's worse things than having your go from 20% to 25% for 6 months, and then in 5 years your unemployment rate is 7%. I think
given the sort of mean time of Greek and Italian governments, like you get again to the elite incentives that like you personally are going to be screwed. Like you are going to be out of power. You will never be back in power. Your party will have a taint behind it. Like all of the guys like 2 levels down that are kind of the core of your party's foot soldiers, where they're the guys who know people. They're the guys who are your next generation. They're all going to have to find new jobs. They're going to have to start at the ground floor of some other party.
If it doesn't
so they're
work,
not on board.
If you screw it up. You know, I think if you can get unemployment down to 7%, which I think you could do, if you can get unemployment down to levels of 2006, I think you would win elections. And you'd have to sell it to people. I'm not a politics guy. I don't know how you'd sell it to people, but I'm just saying what you would have to do. I mean, maybe these countries, you know, need to be. I mean, maybe this is something that could only be done by like a dictatorship. And I'm not actually like even. I don't know if I'm in favor of a dictatorship, but that's what you do. That's what you have to do.
Effectively, at the point at which you're sealing your borders, I mean, you're effectively under martial law. Like whether or not, like theoretically, somebody voted for the guy who's giving out the orders, like
you'd have to go full FDR.
Yeah, I mean, you which is to say, like effectively a fascist state, at least temporarily. It's like, you know, the sovereign is he who decides the state of exception. Like you're going to be declaring some pretty exceptional circumstances.
I mean, maybe these people who are running Italy now, nationalist government, they seem to be pretty serious about immigration. We can see boats being turned away. Maybe they have a plan to do this. Maybe they're working in concert with whatever coalition is behind Donald Trump.
That would be the way to do it, honestly. Like you want it to be a multi-dimensional thing with a lot of different parties involved that are able to mutually support each other. Like this has all of the recipes of a preference cascade where everybody suddenly looks around the room and realizes that everybody else is also looking around the room, and they're all on the same page even if they didn't know it. Like this is like Paul Krugman back when he was a serious economist. This is his model of currency crises, that they don't happen until sort of everybody realizes that they're going to happen, and then it kind of happens all at once. So, I mean, the way that you are going to sort of generate that would be you kind of slyly try to get everybody on the same page, and then you try to engineer a crisis that forces them to act. And I don't think that we're going to lack for either political or economic crises over the next 20 years.
Ας ενωθούμε, η νέα τάξη μας καλεί να συμφωνίες, ο άθεος πολιτισμός. Δεν είσαι πλέον πρόσωπο, μοναχά αριθμός. Ηγέτες κρίση και τραπεζίτες, ιδιοκτήτες καναλιών, μαθαίνουν στα παιδιά μας το δρόμο το σωστό. Δεν θέλω μεγάλο αφεντικό, γιατί έμαθα ελεύθερος να ζω και στους δρόμους θα το πω. Κράτησε την πίστη σφιχτά στα μεγάλα ιδανικά. Η πατρίδα δεν πουλιέται, η εκκλησία δεν πεθαίνει, η ιστορία δεν ξεχνιέται. Μιλούν για ειρήνη και βομβαρδίζουν, μας ασφαλίζουν μ' απειλές. Οι αστυνομοί των λαών και οι ανθρωπιστές. Αγάπη, αλήθεια, δικαιοσύνη, τα τρώει ο εξυγχρονισμός. Κρατήσου αδελφέ μου, υπάρχει και Θεός. Δεν θέλω